All right, folks, it's Super Bulldog weekend coming up on April 21st is the actual spring football game as part of the festivities and kind of the highlight surrounding, of course, baseball, softball, and tennis as well at Mississippi State. We bring in Daniel Black, For Whom the Cowbell Tolls, the Mississippi State platform on SB Nation to talk up the football side of things. Daniel, how you doing today?
I'm just fine, Mark. How are you?
Well, I just realized that I've adorned myself properly, not just for Mississippi State conversation, but especially Super Bulldog weekend. So this is, if you can give us a feel for this, not me in particular, because I experienced about 6 of these, but it's a big deal. And it's good that the other portions of the SEC sports landscape cooperate in regards to giving Mississippi State the home field for this weekend.
Oh, absolutely. It's Super Bulldog weekend is just a weekend full of sports. There's always the spring game, a home baseball series, a home softball series, and a couple of like tennis matches going on basically simultaneously. It's always a big deal. There's always a cooking competition that goes on. It's basically if there's one weekend in the spring in which state fans sort of all want to flock to, it's Super Bulldog weekend. I remember guess it's been 4 years by now. Mississippi State, we very wisely scheduled the Ole Miss series on Super Bulldog weekend for baseball, and it attracted the largest single game crowd in the history of the NCAA for a baseball game that weekend. Over 15,500 people showed up for that. State won the game, by the way, which is a good thing. But always there's baseball series, softball, and it's sort of the cherry on top is the spring game that always happens simultaneously in this one weekend.
Yeah, it brings back a lot of memories for me. Mississippi State always good in baseball during the run from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and into the 2000s. For me, Ole Miss was actually a good baseball program just at the time that I was there, and that was not the case prior to that. So there were a lot of fun baseball series there with a few future major league players. The tennis program was extremely good at that point. Don't know how good they are now, but they were like a top 5 program. And the softball was just getting underway, I believe, in the mid 90s. So it was about a 3 or 4 year program at that point. So where did the rest of these programs stand? Baseball, softball, and tennis. How good are they?
Well, our softball team's ranked in the top 25. We're playing a series with Ole Miss as we speak. I think we won earlier today, and there's going to be another game. I think there's a doubleheader today. Our tennis program is still it's not top 5, but it's still easily one of the top 20 programs in the country. I think we're ranked 7th this year, like a 17-2 regular season record. We only lost one SEC match this year, and I think that was like Texas A&M, who's in the top 5. Baseball, we're having a down year this year, primarily because of some distractions with a mid-season coaching change. But as a whole, I mean, we won the SEC 2 years ago, made it to a super regional last year, and made it to the College World Series championship series just 5 years ago. So our baseball program, despite this one down year, is still in pretty in good shape.
All right, we're talking football with Daniel Black from For Whom the Cowbell Tolls on the SB Nation platform for the Bulldogs and the spring scrimmage coming up this Saturday, maroon and white. So quarterback situation is a huge focus for every program, and it seems as though there are more quarterback battles across the country than I can remember, but not so much at Mississippi State. Nick Fitzgerald battling back from that horrific injury against Ole Miss, but Keaton Thompson, based on his level of play in the Egg Bowl, but then kind of building on that in the bowl game victory over Louisville, seems to be impressing Joe Moorhead based on the comments that I've heard. So set us up for the quarterback situation.
Well, I'd say that that's going to be the most fascinating thing to see in the spring game, and just as a whole as spring practice goes on, because Keaton Thompson's been getting a very large majority of the first team reps as Nick Fitzgerald rebounds from this injury. Nick Fitzgerald is almost 100%, and that was expected in the prognosis of his injury immediately after the Egg Bowl back in November. But still, Keaton Thompson is getting those first team reps, which is going to be good for Mississippi State's future. You mentioned how he played a majority of the Egg Bowl, and he had a really good performance in the Tax Slayer Bowl against Louisville. But that's going to be fascinating to see how Nick Fitzgerald performs. And also just to see the differences in Joe Moorhead's system. Obviously Dan Mullen is one of the top offensive minds in the country and did great things with all of Mississippi State's quarterbacks. And Nick Fitzgerald, you could tell his progress last season. but Joe Moorhead has sort of promised to add a little bit to that. See, maybe let Nick Fitzgerald let him or set him free, I guess. But we'll see how he'll perform in Joe Moorhead's system. Just where his comeback is in terms of his injury. But in addition to that, saying how Keaton Thompson performs after his solid performances last season.
Yeah, so for Nick Fitzgerald, despite missing basically the last 2 games of the season, still accounted for 29 touchdowns throwing and running and almost 1,000 yards rushing after a prolific 2016 campaign, especially on the ground. And you mentioned Keaton Thomas hit on about 49% of his passes, 2 touchdowns and 2 picks. And again, we saw the improvement from the Ole Miss game a month later against Louisville in the upset win over the Cardinals. Should be very interesting. I know Joe Moorhead made the comment recently that with the coaching staff completely turned over, obviously a focal point of spring practice was to get the foundation of the 3 units in play in regards to terminology and philosophy, and to sell that and get that fully entrenched. Not that things aren't going to continue to mount in regards to development and complexity of those playbooks and those schemes on all 3 units in August, but that they wanted to lay the foundation. They got to that point with the offense, the defense, and the special teams. The wide receivers will come into play as well, and we see a lot of fresh faces there here in the spring.
Oh, absolutely. A year ago, despite the fact, I mean, even with Nick Fitzgerald's solid play through the air, he was pretty limited at receiver. He had 2 senior receivers, Donald Gray and Gabe Miles, who both battled injury throughout the season. And beyond that, the receiver play was, to be honest, quite subpar. So Dan Mullen, in his class, when he was still the head coach at State for the 2018 class, wanted to make sure he put an emphasis on the wide receivers. And the moment Mullen left and Joe Moorhead was brought in, that was his first priority, to make sure he gets those receivers signed. We're bringing in 3 4-star receivers. Devontae Jason from New Orleans, Stephen Guidry from Raymond, Mississippi, who went to Hines Community College, and Malik Heath went to Callaway High School. He was the #1 prospect in the state. That's one of the outside of quarterbacks. I would say that's one of the most fascinating things to see in the spring game and spring practice, is just to see how those receivers are coming along and to see how they'll perform. I mean, the thing about the spring game, I was watching an interview with, I think it was Will Muschamp, I guess, asking him, is the spring game more for the fans than anything? And he said, well, it's a fan event. But it's a fascinating place to see in front of a crowd in the actual home stadium how your team is going along. And I think that's the case with a lot of other coaches. I think that's their mindsets for spring games. And that's going to be the case with these 3 wide receivers. They're going to be in Davis Wade Stadium for the very first time in front of a pretty big crowd. Joe Moorhead has been asking the fans to break the spring game attendance record. He's been leaving voicemails on people's phones, on season ticket holders' phones. When he's going for it, he really wants a big crowd there. So to see how these 3 wide receivers, which in my opinion will be the turning point, but just to see the improvement of wide receiver play, I think that'll be the turning point between maybe a 7-8 win team this year to a 9-10 win team, because I think this team has that capabilities to possibly get to that 10-win plateau. Those wide receivers are going to be extremely important. So seeing where they stand, seeing their progress in Joe Moorhead's system, knowing that this is their first year on campus, will be very fascinating to see.
Yeah, there's a slightly different approach depending on the school in regards to the spring game. And I'm going back 10 or 15 years in which it seemed as though across the board, the spring game was actually played like a game, or like a scrimmage, like an all-out full pad scrimmage, start to finish. We're running the clock as we would during normal play. People are tackling, they're hitting. It's not the intensity of playing the Egg Bowl exactly, but it's probably 80% of Louisiana Texan town. There's some level of intensity, and it's played like a real game. Now, coaches have backed off considerably on that in the last 5 to 10 years. They don't want to see guys get hurt. and they backed off. You see some tackling with a lot of these spring games for about a quarter, and then they're like, okay, that's enough. We've seen enough. So it's kind of difficult to gauge the line play and the tackling and how good it is. Would this runner or this quarterback gotten away from this guy? Who knows? He was just able to reach out and get him by a fingertip, so he's down. But I certainly think that the wide receiver play against the defensive backs is legitimate because they can go at it pretty similar to what you would see in a regular game. But it's interesting, and also the aspect that you just brought up, because they're scrimmaging a handful of times, 2 to 5 times with the same intensity behind closed doors. But this is the time in front of the crowd. And it's a friendly crowd, but it's still 50,000 seats, 30,000 people, whatever the number for some guys that just played in high school or played at the junior college level. And they play in front of a lot of people, maybe for the first time. And you bring up these 3 wide receivers, Guidry, the number 1 JUCO wide receiver coming out. The other 2 guys, as you mentioned, Jason and Heath, top 30 at their position, is both 4 stars. So it'll be interesting to see their development. And if they're able to make some big plays against the Mississippi State defense, which should be one of the better units in the SEC this fall. All right, Daniel Black joining us to set us up for Super Bulldog weekend, the football aspect of it, of course, with the maroon and white going at it April 21st at the stadium. Let's look at recruiting. So we just talked about 3 huge gets at the wide receiver position, Daniel, for 2018 in a class that was in the top half of the SEC. Your thoughts and maybe some analysis and some new information about the progress toward 2019.
Well, the 2018 class, it was solid. It was solid from the get-go, from the moment when Mullen was there, when Mullen left, and we lost a couple guys, but Moorhead was able to sign a majority of them, a very large majority of them. He and his staff, getting his staff together quickly and getting in there and signing these guys were extremely important. Ended up finishing with a top 25 class. Highlighted by those 3 wide receivers. But the 2019 class is one that people across the state of Mississippi, whether you're at Mississippi State, Ole Miss, or Southern Miss, wherever, this is a class that the state of Mississippi has been banking on. And it's also a class that outside schools such as Alabama, Auburn, LSU, what have you, and the surrounding states, they're going after these Mississippi guys too, because by a multitude of sources inside the state of Mississippi who cover recruiting, they say that this is one of, if not the best high school classes the state of Mississippi has ever seen. And Mississippi State and Joe Moorhead, they've already been taking advantage of it. It's April 15th, and we already have 9 commits in this class, ranked currently by 24/7, the 8th ranked class in the country. A couple of days ago, it was 5th. But in the last 2 weeks, we've signed 3 4-stars as a whole in this class. We signed 4, 3 of which are defensive ends. This is something that Joe Moorhead, this is something that Mullen, Sylvester Cream, Jackie Sherrill, this is something that from the dawn of Mississippi State's time as in football, I guess, we've wanted hard-nosed defenses. That's been an extremely important factor, whether it be Croom, Mullen, now Moorhead. We've signed 3 4-star defensive ends, Charles Moore, DeMonte Russell, and this name is, I've never heard anyone pronounce it, so I'm going to give it a go. Ani Iskowu. I don't know.
Good for you, Daniel, to give it a shot. Better you than me. I'm looking at it right now myself.
Yes, I don't know how to pronounce it, but he's from Nashville.
He turns out to be a player. Everybody's going to know his name around the SEC in a couple of years.
Yes, but those 3 guys are really good gets, and Quentin Torber, wide receiver out of Louisiana, 4-star. That's just 4 right off the bat right there, 3 of which have signed within the last 2 weeks, giving Mississippi State right now a top 10 class in the country. In addition to that, probably Joe Moorhead's his most important get so far is Garrett Schrader, who's a 3-star dual threat quarterback out of Charlotte, North Carolina. He was a guy that was recruited heavily by Joe Moorhead when he was at Penn State. The moment Moorhead got to Mississippi State, that is, he offered Garrett Schrader. He was getting chased by South Carolina, but he ended up committing to Mississippi State. He's 6'4", 6'5", 200 pounds. I mean, he's sort of that Nick Fitzgerald type quarterback that Joe Moorhead will be able to do a lot of things with. So this year's recruiting, or this upcoming year's recruiting class for Mississippi State is shaping up to be a really good one, easily one of the best in Mississippi State's history, as long as we can keep this going. But it's shaping up to be a really good class, and it's already showing with who we've gotten committed so far.
Daniel, I'll take a shot at Ani Izuchukwu. We'll go with that.
That's better than my pronunciation.
He's number 14 at his position, weak side defensive end out of Nashville. Torber's a top 50 player at wide receiver, as you mentioned, out of Louisiana. Schrader is the 13th rated dual threat quarterback. All these are 247 ratings. So we're talking about top end players coming to Mississippi State. And the statement that you made off the top, I think needs to be emphasized, that we're talking about a state in Mississippi. Okay, throw out Texas, California, Florida, because they're not only elite in producing talent, they have huge population. So the numbers are always going to be slanted that way. 40% of the top 300 players, 500 players come from those three states. It's crazy. But we got to consider population, and looking at Louisiana and Mississippi in particular produce tremendous levels of talent considering the population per capita. It's amazing the NFL players produced by Mississippi, and some of the all-time legends, obviously Walter Payton, Brett Favre, Jerry Rice, on down the line. So to make the statement that this could be the best pool of talent ever is pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's something that's been thrown out there for the last couple of years. Just even when the 2017 class was being signed, 2019 was the class that people were pointing at. 2019, Mississippi State started offering these guys 3-4 years ago. This is a class that has the potential to be one of, if not the best in the history of the state, whether they're going to schools in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, or way out all across the country. Programs are going after these guys in the state of Mississippi, and it's exciting to see. As a fan of a school in Mississippi, whether you're a State fan, Ole Miss fan, Southern Miss fan, on down the line to Jackson State and Alcorn State, it's exciting to see this happening.
Yeah, I'd just like to know who these scouts are that are that good to see these guys as freshmen running around and sophomores and be able to project that they're going to be SEC caliber players. Is pretty crazy as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we got Daniel Black on the line from For Whom the Cowbell Tolls. It's the SB Nation platform for Mississippi State athletics, and setting us up for the Super Bulldog weekend, and of course the spring game with the maroon going against the white. Daniel, we appreciate you stopping by. You got us all set. It was a really good conversation, so thanks for the insight and information.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it as always.